Europeans used to mock American cars, now they're fainting over these giant vehicles. The story lives up to its title, and behind it is a wave of praise that even the people writing it never saw coming. For years on forums and social media groups, Europeans have routinely called America's large trucks and SUVs pointless, showy, needlessly gas-guzzling. But when they themselves set foot in America and stood next to those vehicles in real life, not in a photo, not in a video, wave after wave of TikTok clips, posts and reels capturing that exact moment exploded online, and underneath every one of them sat hundreds of comments that were no longer mocking, but a completely different kind of admiration. Take the same large pickup truck, park it in Rome or Amsterdam, and it might be called ridiculous, showy, even dangerous to pedestrians. But park that same vehicle in a parking lot in Texas, and it's simply an ordinary car, nobody bothers to turn their head. And the more they looked into why, the more Europeans realized it isn't showing off, it's a spacious, free, practical way of living that they themselves, standing on their own narrow streets, secretly wished they had too. The question all those videos really raise isn't why are American cars so big, but what turns so many former critics into admirers? The answer, it turns out, sits right inside their own comments. From the initial shock to the "oh, so that's why" moment, to a genuine admiration for a country that dares to live spaciously in the most literal sense. The three waves of comments below, gathered from Facebook, Reddit, X, Instagram, and TikTok, trace that emotional journey, and by the end of it, once enough why questions pile up, a clearer explanation is waiting. Hans wrote, "Got to the parking lot at Miami Airport and couldn't believe my eyes when I saw a Ford F-150 parked right next to the Fiat 500 I'd rented. It was as big as a military truck and mine looked tiny next to it. I'm German and I'd never seen anything like this back home." Right underneath, Camille shared a similar experience. "The moment I landed in America, my hotel host picked up my whole family in a Chevy Suburban. 5 of us with all our luggage, and there was still room to spare. In France, we'd have needed 2 trips." A few lines down, Marco chimed in with his own story. "I'm from Milan, and I watched a Cadillac Escalade pull up outside the hotel and assumed it was a limo for some VIP. Turned out it was just an ordinary SUV belonging to an American family on a business trip." Sophia meanwhile wrote, "I'm Spanish. On my first trip to America, and I saw a monster truck with wheels taller than my head roar over a pile of old cars at a fair in Texas. I just froze for a few seconds, speechless." 4 comments, 4 different cities, but all sharing the same emotional thread: astonishment at something they'd previously only seen on a screen, and underneath every one of those lines, wave after wave of other Europeans left the exact same reply: "Now I finally understand why." That feeling spilled over into the most everyday details too. Lucas wrote, "Stopped for gas at a small station and saw a Ram 3000 500 towing a horse trailer as big as a mobile home on wheels. In Belgium, that definitely wouldn't fit down a single street, yet looking back, it makes surprising sense here." Clara commented right below with a different story but the same feeling. "Parked at a Walmart lot, I looked back at my tiny rental car, swallowed up between 2 giant pickups on either side. At first I found it funny, but thinking about it now, I wish Prague's streets were wide enough for me to try driving one like that just once." None of them went looking for these vehicles. They simply appeared everywhere, and it was precisely that ordinariness that impressed them most. For some, the astonishment went further, becoming a way of looking back at themselves. Jonas wrote, "I'm Austrian and I stopped by a dealership in Denver just to look around, then stood next to a GMC Sierra Denali feeling as small as standing beside a steel elephant. But it's an elephant anyone can own, not just the rich." Right below that, Julia was blunter still. "If I ever move to America, the first thing I'd do is buy a giant pickup truck, even though I have no idea what I'd use it for. Just because here it's normal and nobody judges you for it, completely unlike Italy." And perhaps Piotr summed up the shared feeling most neatly of all in a comment thousands agreed with: "In Poland, if you drive a big car, you're seen as showing off. In America, I finally understood it's not showing off, it's just freedom." And I like that more than I expected. And it's not just personal vehicles, Elin wrote. An American fire truck parked outside a small station in an Ohio town was so big I had to film it. In Finland, a fire truck that size only exists in big cities, and this is just a town of a few thousand people with a truck bigger than the one in Helsinki, our capital. Her comments set off a chain of others posting photos of fire trucks, garbage trucks, even school buses back home for comparison, a harmless little game that always ended with the same line. Everything really is bigger in America. But the wave of comments didn't stop at astonishment. The more they read, the more people began digging into the reasons, and that process left them more impressed with America, not less. Mateus wrote, "I'm from Poland, and I used to think big American cars were about showing off. After 3 days driving distances that in Europe you'd cover by plane, I got it. This isn't a choice, it's a necessity. America built an entire highway system to give these vehicles room to breathe." Just as he realized, the average American commutes about 41 miles a day, compared to under 18 miles in Europe, a distance over which a small car struggles to offer the same comfort. A different angle, but the same conclusion came from Anke. "I asked an American friend why everyone drives a pickup, and he just laughed and said, 'Because I need to haul lumber, tow the boat, take the whole family camping.' I realized. In the Netherlands, I rent a truck every time I move. Here they just pop the tailgate." Eric, meanwhile, recalled a more specific moment. "I'm Swedish, and standing outside a Ford showroom in Michigan listening to a salesman explain an F-150's towing capacity, I couldn't help but blurt out, 'This isn't bragging. It's genuinely a machine built to work.'" Louise, meanwhile, offered an everyday story. "In Denmark, a camping trip like that would need 2 vehicles and a rented trailer. In Colorado, I watched a tent, stove, kayak, and 4 mountain bikes all get loaded into the bed of a Toyota Tundra in 10 minutes flat, with room to spare for the dog." It's no accident that America's best-selling vehicle for nearly half a century has been the Ford F-150, a large pickup truck, not a sedan. For many Europeans, it's that very normalization, not the vehicle itself, that's most worth admiring. On safety and durability too, Europeans gradually shifted their perspective. Wouter wrote, "I'm Belgian, and I used to think big cars were dangerous to everyone else. That's partly true, but for the people inside them, survival rates in a crash are much higher." Petra, meanwhile, told a different story, also from a garage in Ohio. "I'm Slovenian, and the mechanic showed me an F-250 with over 400,000 miles on its original engine. Back home, a car lasting half that is already considered durable." The third wave of comments got even more blunt. Many started comparing directly to their own home countries, and most came away feeling like the losing side. Inez wrote, "In Germany, if you want to buy a large SUV, you pay extra environmental tax, extra weight tax, not to mention parking downtown is nearly impossible. In America, you just buy it." Teo, meanwhile, brought a more specific policy angle. "I live in Paris, where the city just tripled parking fees for heavy SUVs right in the center. We're taxing the very thing Americans treat as normal." Anna compared it to a different country across the Pacific. "I'm Portuguese, and in Europe our old towns are just as cramped as Japan's, where they've had to maintain an entire K-car micro-vehicle policy for over 70 years. But America is different. They have the land, the roads, and they chose not to shrink down." Right underneath, Sophie agreed, "I used to laugh at my friend for showing off his new Suburban in America. Now, I wish London had enough room for me to do the same." By the time this piece was put together, that comment had drawn over 8,000 agreeing replies, most of them from people who used to be loyal fans of the online mock American cars movement. Nicholas, meanwhile, did the math. "I'm in Norway, where import and weight taxes push the price of a large SUV to double what it costs in America. The pickup my friend in Texas bought costs half of what I'd pay for a mid-size SUV in Oslo after tax." Elias wrote a long comment that got reshared across European car groups. "I'm Swiss. Here, a large SUV can face import tax, CO2 tax, and highway fees that together run into the tens of thousands of francs. We take pride in our clean mountain roads and our compact cars, but sometimes I wonder, is that really a choice, or are we just rationalizing something policy forces on us? Watching Americans drive big cars without a second thought, I feel more jealous than I'd like to admit." The comment was later translated into 4 different languages by followers themselves, a sign it had touched something many Europeans were quietly thinking but few dared to say outright. What's interesting is that none of them denied the reasons their own countries chose differently. But the more they understood why, the more clearly they admired America, not because a big car is better than a small one, but because America built a society where that spaciousness is within everyone's reach, not a privilege for the few. The 3 waves of comments have told the emotional story in full, but to fully understand why America can go big like this, and why that in the end deserves admiration rather than mockery, takes 6 different lenses, each revealing a piece of the picture. The first lens, the simplest one, is geography. The US has a population density of only about 91 people per square mile, compared to roughly 300 in France, 600 in Germany, and up to 720 in the UK. For a country nearly as large as all of Europe combined, but with only 2/3 the population, space simply isn't scarce. A suburban parking lot in Texas can be larger than the central square of more than a few European towns. When space is that abundant, the question, is this car too big, barely exists. It's only big next to an old Italian street, not next to a parking lot in Oklahoma. That's not American showiness, it's a math problem about space that very few developed nations get to solve this way. The second lens is economics, and it's probably the one that surprises Europeans most once they look into it. Gas in the US costs roughly half to a third of what it does in most of Europe, largely because European fuel taxes are set high to curb emissions, while the US federal gas tax has barely changed in decades. Add to that the fact that buying an SUV or pickup in the US skips the weight tax, environmental tax, or size-based fees you'd face in Germany or Norway, and owning a giant vehicle here is simply far cheaper than in Europe, not because Americans are richer, but because their tax policy doesn't interfere. The third lens is infrastructure. In 1956, the US broke ground on the Interstate Highway System, a federal freeway network stretching over 77,000 kilometers, designed with wide lanes, gentle turns, and spacious parking at every stop. Most major American cities also grew after the automobile had already become widespread, so streets, parking, and neighborhoods were planned around cars from the very first blueprint. By contrast, most major European cities, Rome, Paris, Amsterdam, had existed for centuries before the first automobile, so their streets are still sized for pedestrians and horse carts. A large pickup truck isn't a poor fit for America. It was born at the right time, in the right place, into infrastructure that was already waiting for it. The fourth lens is work culture. For millions of Americans in farming, construction, home repair, or who simply love outdoor activities like camping, fishing, or towing a boat, a truck isn't a luxury item, it's a work tool. Quite a few comments in the 3 waves above touched on exactly this. The vehicle wasn't bought to look cool, but to haul lumber, tow a trailer, or load camping gear in 10 minutes flat. In a country where the distance between a city and rural land can be just a few dozen minutes drive, the line between a commuter car and a hauling vehicle barely exists, people need one vehicle that does both. And the American auto industry has spent nearly half a century perfecting exactly that. The fifth lens, perhaps the one that cuts deepest for Europeans emotionally, is freedom of choice. In many European countries, a car's size, weight, and fuel consumption are all bound by layers of regulation, CO2 tax, weight tax, and emissions limits that keep tightening in city centers. In America, those constraints barely exist at the same level. An ordinary American with no wealth or special privilege can simply walk into a dealership and buy the biggest vehicle they want. As long as they can afford the payments, nobody taxes that choice as a penalty, nobody asks them to justify it. That's exactly what Piotr, the Pole from the first wave, called freedom instead of showing off, and it's what leads more than a few Europeans, despite pride in their home country's civilized, frugal ways, to quietly admit sometimes choice matters more than optimization. And the final lens is history. America was built on the spirit of westward expansion, a young nation that has always celebrated conquering more space rather than staying within existing boundaries. The Ford F-150, America's best-selling vehicle for nearly half a century, isn't by accident named after strength and the frontier. Bigger is better in America isn't simply a joke about showing off. It's part of a cultural inheritance tied to the American dream. Everyone deserves more space, more choice, more possibility than the generation before. When a European stands next to a giant pickup in a Walmart parking lot, what they're really standing next to, whether they realize it or not, is the physical embodiment of that very dream. 6 lenses, one conclusion. America isn't big by accident. It's the result of geography, tax policy, infrastructure, work culture, personal freedom, and a historical spirit, all combining into something very few other nations could replicate, even if they wanted to. And perhaps no one proves it more vividly than a Scotsman who happened to drive across 7 US states, never intending to look for any of those 6 lenses, yet stumbling onto all of them. Exactly that. Jean-Luc Cartwright, a Scotsman who calls himself an extreme car nerd, had never read any of the 6 lenses above before setting off, but his trip, as it happened, brushed against nearly all of them. On a 3-week, over 4,000-mile road trip through 7 US states with his family, Cartwright kept stumbling onto car scenes beyond anything he'd imagined, even though the trip was never meant to be about cars. Right in Dallas, driving on the highway, he glanced to his right and saw around 100 classic cars lined up, waiting to be handed over to new owners. He'd stumbled onto the tail end of a specialist classic car auction. That evening at the Fort Worth stockyards, he witnessed a scene he described as the closest he's ever felt to being in a Fast and Furious movie if Dominic Toretto drove a pickup. A steady stream of lifted trucks, lowriders, sports cars, and the occasional horse cruising the main strip every Saturday night as if it were just an ordinary part of the town's routine rather than an organized event. A few days later in Nashville, Cartwright dropped by a classic car dealership called Maple Motors purely out of curiosity. He himself owns a 1973 Chevrolet C10 back in Scotland, one of his many never-ending restoration projects. When the team there learned he owned a C10 all the way in the UK, they tipped him off about the C10 Nationals happening the very next day at Nashville Speedway, something he'd never even thought to check against his own trip dates. He decided to stay an extra night, and the next day, standing among thousands of C10s, the same model as the only one he'd ever seen in the UK, his own, he admitted, "This place blew my mind," he said a few days later, standing inside the Summit Racing parts store in Atlanta, which he likened to Toys R Us for petrolheads. About the builds at the C10 Nationals, all he could say was, the builds, wow, they were just next level. But the peak of the whole trip came completely by chance, on a short coastal drive from Mobile, Alabama to New Orleans. After a breakfast of a few beignets, he started seeing more and more classic cars on the road, alongside signs reading "Cruisers Welcome." Just 10 minutes later, he realized he'd driven straight into the middle of an event called Cruising the Coast, where thousands of classic and muscle cars paraded continuously along the coastline for miles on end. "Never before had I ever seen anything on this scale," he wrote, admitting he nearly steered his rental Jeep into a lamppost more than once, too distracted by the passing cars. What surprised Cartwright most, by his own account, wasn't any single scene. It was that he hadn't gone looking for any of them. The auction lot in Dallas, the night at Fort Worth stockyards, the C10 Nationals in Nashville, cruising the coast in Mississippi, all of it stumbled upon by accident, woven into a trip planned around his horse-loving wife and daughter, not a car enthusiast. As a European looking in from the outside, the perception of US car culture is one of big trucks, big blocks, and big builds. What you don't expect is to see these things on every street corner, and for it to be so ingrained in American culture itself. And this is exactly where the 3 waves of comments, the 6 analytical lenses, and Cartwright's story converge on one common point. Trucks and SUVs now make up 61% of the new car market in the US, not because Americans love showing off more than the rest of the world, but because each lens, geography, tax, infrastructure, work, freedom, history arrives at the same conclusion. This is a country built, quite literally, to make spaciousness the default. Even Japan, which has maintained its micro K car policy for over 70 years, with nearly half its new cars only half the length of an American pickup, didn't do it for lack of money, but lack of land. America simply never had to shrink down. Europeans weren't wrong to have mocked it from a distance. Given what they could see from back home, that conclusion made perfect sense. It's just that, standing close enough and reading deep enough, they finally saw what they'd never had the chance to before: a country that lets ordinary citizens live spaciously, backed by an entire system of policy and infrastructure, and for many of them, that's more admirable than any brand or slogan. The most interesting part, perhaps, isn't the 6 lenses themselves, but how closely they match what Hans, Mateusz, or Nicholas had already figured out on their own, not from books, not from data, just by standing there, looking, and asking why. When personal instinct and macro-level data point to the same conclusion, that's usually a sign the conclusion is, for the most part, true. Cartwright, the Scotsman who crossed 7 US states without ever intending to look for any of those 6 lenses, closed his account with a blunt, half-joking remark: maybe, when it comes to car culture, it wouldn't hurt for us to be a little more American. That's exactly what thousands of other Europeans, despite once turning American cars into an online joke, now quietly admit underneath every video, post, and reel, capturing the moment they first stood next to a giant vehicle. Not because the vehicle itself is perfect, but because it stands for something bigger, a country where spaciousness, freedom, and room to live comfortably are still real, built not by one factor, but by geography, policy, and culture resonating together across centuries. And that, perhaps, is the most sincere compliment a former critic can give, not praise for the vehicle, but for an entire way of life. Underneath those videos, among thousands of comments from across Europe, one line kept repeating, in different languages, but the same sentiment: we used to laugh, now we understand, and maybe, just a little, we're jealous too.